Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Absolutely delighted to be joined by Labour's leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Nice to see you. Should we get our mutual celebration for the Arsenal victory out the way first?
Oh, well, they're never over, are they?
Well,
did you enjoy it?
Yeah, well, I went with low expectations and they were massively superseded.
You know what? Underdogs win.
Well, got a couple more weeks to see whether that will turn out to be the case. But look, I'm delighted that you've joined me, and obviously this whole issue of security is front of mind. We here at Peston on Sunday have identified at least 17 occasions you voted against anti-terror laws designed to keep us safe. Do you now regret voting in that way?
First of all, let's be absolutely clear. What happened in Manchester was abominable. The deaths are appalling and the trauma will never go away. And the response of the people of Manchester in Albert Square less than 18 hours after the attack was remarkable, in that they called for unity of communities in order to defeat the terrorism that has been perpetrated by this individual against those people. And I think we've got to be clear that is a response.
Secondly, no, totally, but nonetheless, people have got a choice on June the 8th, and the choice will partly be about who they think is going to keep them safest.
OK, on your point about anti-terror laws, yes, I have been assiduous in my scrutiny of anti-terror laws
voting against
in Parliament, and voting against, in common with David Davis, on occasions Theresa May and others, on the basis that anti-terror laws are important, but they must be subject to judicial oversight. My concern was always we were going down the road of executive orders, executive detention and executive control. Everything must be subject to a judicial process. Why did I form this opinion? Because I represent a constituency that had, still has, a large Irish population, many of whom were detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the 1970s, again without judicial oversight. It was the attempted criminalisation of large numbers of young people, which of course drives them in a very bad direction. So my point on the anti-terror laws was not that you don't need an effective anti-terror strategy. You must have an independent judicial oversight of what goes on.
But you have been vocal in your opposition to the monitoring of suspected terrorists. Was that a mistake?
I've been vocal in my opposition to executive control orders that are not subject to judicial oversight.
No, on TPIM notices, which actually, you know, the former terrorist czar Alex Carlisle says don't go far enough in providing us with restrictions on the behaviour of suspected terrorists. You said that they were a very, very serious attack on our liberty, and it's important that we oppose them.
Yes, because of the question of judicial oversight. That was the point. I do support and work with the police and our security services on intelligence-led actions. And what this government has
not... But they would argue that if they have to act swiftly, there are times when judicial oversight is not appropriate.
Well, they can intervene on the basis of suspicion at any time of a criminal intent taking place. They can do that anyway. That's what the police are for.
But so to be absolutely clear, were you to become Prime Minister, you would, if necessary, enact more restrictive laws on to monitor, restrict the activities of potential terrorists. Because let's be clear, I mean, MI5 says there are, as you know, at least 3,000 individuals in this country who are a direct threat to our security, and possibly 23,000 in total who could be a great threat to the security and lives of our people.
Yes, and those people are presumably, I hope, being monitored on an intelligence-led basis. But it seems that the cuts in police numbers have led to some very dangerous situations emerging. It's also a question of a community response as well, so that where an imam, for example, alerts the police that he's very concerned about somebody, I would hope they would act. And I hope they would have the resources to act as well.
Now, in the past, you have regularly described terrorists in terms of your actions and sometimes in terms of your words as essentially freedom fighters. Do you regret that?
No, I've never used those words.
But in
No, I've never used those words. I do not believe that individual acts of terror are acceptable in any circumstances, because if you want political change, then you pursue political change through democratic means. The problem in some countries is when the democratic process is closed down, other things take over.
You explicitly said that you've not talked with the IRA, but your Shadow Home Secretary says that's not right.
I have not spoken to the IRA. I have in the past,
shared a
still
platform
do,
with a former...
often meet people from Sinn Féin, and my whole
former
approach...
convicted IRA terrorists.
Indeed.
So why is that not talking with the IRA?
I've met former prisoners who told me they were not in the IRA. But I have met former prisoners with my eyes open on it, on the basis that there had to be a development of a peace process in Northern Ireland. And I think we should look at the awful period of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the attempt to get a military solution to those problems as something that we all learn a lesson from. And surely the ceasefires, the two ceasefires, followed by the Good Friday Agreement and the acceptance of the differing historical traditions between the nationalist and the unionist communities in Ireland is something that has brought about a long-term peace from which the rest of the world has learnt many lessons. Surely we could give credit to all those unionists and Republicans who brought that about.
But people are looking for a leader most likely to bring greater security to the country. If you look at those who succeeded in brokering peace with the IRA, Tony Blair, John Major, they were people who were much more explicitly opposed to the IRA than you ever were.
They brought about a peace process. I remember having quite long discussions with John Major about this after he ceased to be Prime Minister, about the difficulties of achieving it and the need to have lots of conduits of discussion. And if you trace the history back of the Northern Ireland peace process, the crucial moment was probably the way in which John Hume of the SDLP and Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin stepped aside from their own comfort zone, if you like, and held private discussions to bring about that accord, which brought a degree of unity on the nationalist side, which meant we then moved on to the historic agreement with the Ulster Unionists.
Now, you obviously do believe that negotiation talking is terribly important. After the Paris attacks, you said that we needed a more urgent effort to reach a negotiated settlement of the civil war in Syria and the end to the threat from ISIS. That did sound like you would be prepared to talk to ISIS.
No, I've never said I'd talk to ISIS. What I did...
But that was the implication.
Well, that's an implication you have chosen to draw from it. It was not the implication at all.
So how do we how do we find a peace if unlike the IRA, we can't talk to them?
Look, if we don't bring about a ceasefire in Syria between the various warring factions, some of which are nearer to ISIS than others, some of which are very pro-Western, some of which are Syrian government, some of which are pro-Russian, there has to be a peace process there. There also has to be a serious question mark about where ISIS gets its funds from, where it gets sells its oil to, where it gets its arms from, and look at those connections all across the region. And also, if I may say so, you can't exclude the huge spaces of Libya that have no effective government in them whatsoever, and therefore are a breeding ground for the most awful things. I think we have to look at Libya as well.
Now, Diane Abbott has just said on the BBC, in relation to her history with the IRA and Sinn Féin, it was 34 years ago. I had an afro, the hairstyle has gone, the views have gone. Lots of people will see that as trivialising a very important shift in her position.
Well, Diane's hairstyle is a matter for Diane.
But views on the IRA, most people would say, are somewhat more important than how you wear your hair.
Well, you raised the question of the hair, if I may say so, not me.
Well, no, she raised it.
Oh, OK. Well, you've reported on the raising of it. All right, never mind. Listen...
But is that appropriate language for somebody who, under a Labour government, would be Home Secretary?
Look, we learnt, all of us, a lot from the whole experience of Northern Ireland. Remember what it was like. You and I are old enough to remember exactly what it was like in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yep.
The military presence all over Northern Ireland, the huge divide between communities, the lack of any communication between communities, the idea there would be a military solution when we knew there wouldn't be. Listen, I remember arguing with many people in Parliament, and when Ian Paisley was thrown out of Parliament for accusing the Prime Minister of talking to the Republicans, which she denied she was, and it turns out she probably was, I actually defended him on being thrown out of Parliament.
Look, I have to just push you on this. Would Diane, given the sort of things you just said, be your Home Secretary?
Diane is our Home Affairs spokesperson, and I'm looking to appoint our shadow cabinet.
Jeremy resisted the temptation to disappear to his allotment, and he's still here. But first, Anushka.
Thanks, Robert. Lots of reaction from Twitter, including from The Sun's Tom Newton-Dunn, who quotes Jeremy Corbyn saying, "I've never spoken to the IRA. I've met former prisoners who told me they weren't members," to which Tom adds, "despite their convictions." Also, lots of people tweeting about Diane Abbott's comments about her afro, including Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times, who says, former Tory spad, "I was going to get a haircut next week, but now I'm worried it will change my world view." Robert.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of other points connected to these security issues. You are a great believer in Britain's humanitarian tradition of taking political refugees. Given what we now know about Salman Obeidi, were we right to allow his parents into the country?
If they had a case for humanitarian protection or full asylum on the basis of being under threat of social, religious or political persecution, yes. Are we right to monitor and examine such people's views? Yes. Whether that happened to his parents, I don't know. That will no doubt come out of the investigation. But I think we should be clear that under the 1951 Convention, we have a clear obligation to take people who are under serious threat. That was the whole point about it.
Now, you've said very clearly that you're not a pacifist. What military engagements by Britain since the war have been appropriate?
I think where we've been involved in UN peacekeeping operations, that is appropriate. Where we've helped with bringing about ceasefires and ending a civil war, such as in Zimbabwe in 1981 during the independence period, there was important. Also, I think the British support for the UN operation in East Timor helped to bring an end to what was a truly appalling civil war. I think our forces have done amazingly good work in the Mediterranean in protecting humanitarian, well, helping people who would otherwise be...
Any of Tony Blair's engagements?
I think the question of Sierra Leone is an important one because...
Was he right to intervene in Sierra Leone? Would you have done so?
It's a difficult one because I need to go back into all of the cases around it. I didn't oppose it at the time.
Kosovo?
Put it that way. Kosovo, I had my doubts because of the degree of bombing that went on, and I thought there should have been more efforts put into a UN-brokered peace process, but also, crucially, looking beyond that.
But learning about the genocide, would you think you were wrong then? In which case?
I would also say where there is a clear threat of genocide that can be prevented. I'm thinking here Rwanda, Burundi, where there was no intervention of any meaningful size by anyone, despite the UN wanting to do so. I thought something could and should have been done there, and I've been in Rwanda and Burundi and spoken to people there who went through the horrors of that genocide. Now, and it seems to me there's a sort of sometimes different calculations made about issues in Africa compared to the rest of the world.
Now, I want to move on to your broader plans.
Yes.
Particularly your plans for public services. Can I just ask a simple question? Do you regard the Institute for Fiscal Studies as the best arbiter of the credibility of spending and taxing plans?
Well, they're independent. They are obviously extremely thoughtful. They're robust in their investigation of people's economic plans and robust in their examination of public finances. So, yes, of course, they're very important.
So they say that your plans to tax would not raise the 49 billion that you hope, but would only raise 40. So where's the other 9 going to come from?
I would question them on this because one of the taxes, for example, about overseas property would be a completely new tax, and they therefore have no basis on which they can examine the effect of it or otherwise. And we're happy to discuss that.
But even without that, they say there is a big hole in your plans. Which other taxes are going to go up to pay
Well,
for
we
that?
dispute that because we believe that our figures are robust, and we're more than happy to discuss it with them. As I said, there are new taxes involved.
Okay, we understand that on that you disagree with them. But they also say on corporation tax, you've created this illusion that this is a pain-free tax for people. They say it's inevitable that prices that companies charge will go up if you put up corporation tax. They also say that they will almost certainly pay employees less.
Well,
so you're carrying out a deceit on the British people by somehow, putting forward the idea that if you put up company taxes...
Hang on, Robert. You're telling me raising tax is a deceit on the British people if we raise...
Well, because you're implying that ordinary people won't pay for these higher taxes.
You can't really mean that. What we're saying is corporation tax was at 28% in 2010. Mm-hmm. We are proposing to put it back up to 26%, which is obviously less. This government is proposing to reduce it further and actually hand roughly £60 billion over to corporations and in tax relief at the top end between now and 2022. We think that instead of doing that, we should be asking those corporations to pay a bit more, asking the very, very wealthiest to pay a bit more. The alternative is what? More food banks, more homeless people, more people on housing waiting lists, more queues in our hospitals, more than 1 million people already waiting for social care. There is a social crisis looming in Britain that cannot be resolved by continuing tax giveaways to the wealthiest in our society.
Now, I've got to ask you a very important question because it comes from our viewers. As you know, we always ask our viewers for a question.
Good.
And this is from Westminster Mum. It says, don't Labour costings assume all big businesses will stay in the UK and not move elsewhere if you put up corporation tax? What if they leave?
Well, they're still going to be doing business in Britain, and our whole tax idea and our whole tax model is that you're taxed on the business you do in Britain. So if you sell a vast amount of coffee in Britain, then we ask you to pay the tax in Britain for the coffee you've sold rather than pay it in Luxembourg, which clearly could not consume, even if everybody was on a sort of treble espresso every day, could not consume the same amount of coffee as this country.
And then very briefly, and I'm sorry it's got to be brief because we're pretty much out of time, putting up the national minimum wage, even for young people, there are lots who fear that young people simply won't get jobs if they become more expensive.
Well, most companies that pay very low wages could well afford to do so. Our benefit system, in-work...
But aren't you worried about a rise in unemployment?
Our in-work benefit system, to some extent, subsidises employers who could well afford to pay more. Where there are small businesses involved, and I have had discussions with the Federation of Small Businesses about this whole concept, there has to be a pathway through to it, either through tax relief or subsidy or something to get there. But the principle has to be...
So you recognise this is a problem for businesses?
For the small businesses, yes. For the bigger businesses, it's not.
Jeremy Corbyn, very good
Can I give you a present?
to see you, if you like.
It's in the Arsenal colours. It's
in the Arsenal colours. I've already got a colour. I think we knew that your colours were similar. Anyway, very nice to see you. And I just want to pick up with much of what Jeremy said with my guests, Vince Cable and Tasmina. Vince, if I could just start with you. What did you make of Jeremy Corbyn saying that a rising corporation tax is pain-free for people?
Well, the analysis of the independent IFS suggests that it's not. The tax is passed on. I mean, I think the big hole in the Labour revenue proposals, which is what the IFS exposed, was a lot of it depends on being able to tax very highly paid bankers and also a financial transaction tax on the city. Now, if those bankers and the city move out of Britain into Europe, which is already happening because of the Brexit and the hard Brexit and the lack of a single market, the revenue base has disappeared. And that's why, I mean, the IFS take a critical view. I mean, they're criticising the Tories too, and not just Labour, but that there is an assumption in the Labour Party programme that large amounts of revenue can be imposed without any consequences on the people who carry the tax, and that's simply unrealistic.
I mean, let's be absolutely clear. You're, as a party, saying that you're going to put up every rate of income tax
Correct,
by a penny in the pound. Now, some would say that's possibly honest, but also electoral suicide.
I don't think it's electoral suicide. I think we're just making the very simple point to people that you can't have Scandinavian levels of social services and American levels of tax. So we've got to be honest with ourselves as a society. We do want more spending on the health service and social care and schools, and we've got to pay for it as a country. Of course, it's right that the tax should be progressive and that the relatively wealthy would pay relatively more, but equally it's important to say to people you've got to pay a little bit more in income tax in order to support these public services.
Tasmina, is there any element of Labour's economic policy that you and the SNP disagree with?
Well, in terms of the manifesto, it fails to recognise the impact of Brexit, which is the single most important thing that's going to face everybody across this country.
But in terms of taxing, spending, I mean, you're all on the same page, aren't you?
Well, it's quite interesting that some of the Labour manifesto pledges fall upon the very successful policies that the SNP have implemented in Scotland, not least free tuition, free hospital parking. Of course, we've gone beyond that in terms of free school meals and free bus passes. We'll have the benefit of our manifesto launch on Tuesday, Robert, for the First Minister, quite rightly, to be the first person to set out our policy for the future.
Quite a lot of it's been pre-briefed, as you know.
Indeed, including £118 billion investment to protect the UK from the very worst of austerity.
Very Labourish, doesn't it?
To protect the UK from the very worst of austerity. You know, I know we can talk about big politics here, but if we bring this down to people on the ground, and we've all been knocking doors in the campaign, people are suffering, they're feeling the very worst impacts of austerity that aren't making their lives better. We simply can't continue like this. We must change our course, must change our tack. And the very fact that Theresa May is looking to relaunch her election campaign demonstrates that her campaign isn't going very well at all. And why is that? It's because Theresa May has been found out. When challenged on her policies, people know they're not going to work for them in their daily lives.
I'm delighted that Sir Michael Fallon has joined me. Your colleague, Amber Rudd, has said that there would be more terror attacks if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister. That's disreputable alarmism. There's no evidence for that whatsoever.
Well, look at the man's actions, not just his words that he spoke to you this morning about.
Hang on,
but
more terror attacks.
Hang on, just let's look what he's done. This is a man who has opposed, as I think you tried to bring out, every piece of anti-terrorist legislation, who does not support, noticeably this morning, does not support our military action in Iraq and Syria, where the RAF are trying to keep us safe, dealing with terrorists who are planning attacks against Western Europe and indeed against this country, and who's always questioned the nuclear deterrent and indeed our NATO deployments. We would certainly be less safe if Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister.
Well, hang on a second. He says this morning that he would get another 1,000 operatives into the security services. He would increase the numbers of police on the streets. His actions as Prime Minister would go in completely the opposite direction.
No, we're already increasing the number of armed officers in our streets, but presumably he would now start taking out some of the terror legislation that he doesn't like. If you're going to keep people safe...
He has not said that.
Well, if you're going to keep people safe, you have to keep them safe at home and abroad. And I thought was appalling this morning that he's not prepared to support the training that British troops are giving to the Iraqi forces in getting rid of ISIS-Daesh in the Middle East, or the strikes that the RAF are carrying out to deal with terrorists who are planning atrocities in Western Europe and this country. Jeremy Corbyn is soft on terrorism.
You are basing a campaign on making allegations that are simply not supported by the facts. The Prime Minister on Friday said Jeremy Corbyn has said that terrorist attacks on Britain are our own fault. He said no such thing.
He did. I've got his words here. He said foreign policy has been increasing the threat to this country. He said that in his speech on Friday, and this is nonsense.
That is not the same thing as saying the terrorist attacks are our fault. I mean, let's be clear, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, made exactly the same point a few years ago.
No, he didn't.
He did. He made exactly the same point. I've got his words.
I have his words here. Let me read them to you. He said the Iraq War did not create the problem of murderous Islamic fundamentalists.
He said those who argued that the attack on Iraq and the way that we got rid of Saddam without rebuilding Iraq, those people who said that that would increase the risk of terrorism, they had a point. Those were his exact words.
No, he said that...
No, do you want me to show you the article?
He said
Michael, don't argue with me about it. I've got it.
Well, I've got his article. It's here.
No, well, right. We're going to disagree on this.
About foreign interventions, and he implies that somehow this attack can be explained away on the basis of previous foreign interventions by successive governments, and that's wrong.
I don't know which draft you've read, but I mean, the bit I've got is that he says the blame is with the terrorists. But if we are to protect our people, we must be honest about what threatens our security. We must be brave enough to admit the war on terror is simply not working. What's wrong about that?
Well, what's wrong about that is there have been attacks in our country that have been nothing to do with the war against terror. For example, 2005, the London bombings, that was well before we got involved in Libya.
2005 was after Iraq, wasn't it?
No, but it was before Libya. You know, the attack on the Twin Towers, that was well before the Iraq war. So there's no correlation here between foreign policy and this appalling act of terrorism. And that's where Jeremy Corbyn has gone wrong.
Isn't it possible that things like the Iraq war did not create the problem of murderous Islamic fundamentalists, but the war has unquestionably sharpened the resentments felt by such people in this country and given them a new pretext?
Well, I don't think you should allow pretext for people who blow up innocent children.
Because those are actually the words of Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary.
Well, they're not entitled to excuses. You know, this was an act of murder, and of callous murder at that, taking the lives of innocent civilians.
What I just put to you was not Jeremy Corbyn, it was Boris Johnson.
Well, what were the words you were quoting?
The Iraq war did not create the problem of murderous Islamic fundamentalists, though the war has unquestionably sharpened the resentments felt by such people in this country and given them a new pretext. He goes on to say the Iraq war did not introduce the poison into our bloodstream, but yes, the war did help to potentiate that poison. That's exactly the same as what Jeremy Corbyn is saying now.
No, I think it's more is what he's saying that of what I've said. He said you can't use attacks like this to explain away terrorism.
Actually, on the contrary, he said it is difficult to deny that they have a point, the Told You So Brigade.
Well, I don't agree with that.
No,
but there is one important point here, Robert. Come on, you've had a go. There is one important point here. He said it gave them a fabricated pretext.
He did not use the word fabricated.
Well,
in this particular article, he did not say that.
He says pretext. Now, the difference with Jeremy Corbyn is saying that can give them a justification. These people, by the way, are not attacking our foreign policy. They're attacking our home policy, our way of life. They want to blow innocent civilians
You're making
up.
a point about his judgment. Do you accept that you personally, do you now accept that it was wrong of you to go and see Assad after his election victory in 2007?
Oh, 10 years ago, we all hoped that Assad would be a better leader than his father. The government then had
You made a misjudgment, didn't you?
No, we all went to see Assad, MPs from all parties and government ministers. We all hoped...
But you were there. Why won't you admit that it was a mistake?
No, it wasn't a mistake to talk to Assad. We all wanted him to be a better leader of Syria than his father 10 years ago. That has not turned out to be the case.
Well, if Diane Abbott changes her mind, why can't you?
I can certainly tell you now that he's not a good leader of Syria. Of course not. He's been murdering his own people. But at the time, 10 years ago, we all hoped he would be a better leader.
Now, on this negative campaigning, there was a different issue I think I'd like to pick up with you about, which is that in the EU referendum, the Remain side, your side, lost on the basis of a negative campaign. In the London mayoral elections, the negative campaign of Zach Goldsmith backfired appallingly for you. I mean, what you're doing is going to lose you the election, isn't it?
No, we're pointing out there is a very real risk of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister of this country in less than 2 weeks' time. That the negotiations for Brexit, which need to be successful, would be in his hands.
But where is your positive, where is Theresa May's positive vision for Britain?
Well, she set out a vision for successful Brexit negotiations, what we want out of the negotiations, a new special partnership with Europe that covers economic cooperation, covers trade, but also covers security cooperation. And she set out how we want to build a stronger and fairer Britain after that.
Care? Was that a positive message?
Look, everybody knows that we have to get more money into social care, that carers need to be better paid, that the quality of care homes needs to be improved, that we need to reduce the pressure on the NHS, and that some people have to pay at the moment. But we've introduced safeguards so that people will not be losing their homes. Their savings will be protected.
I mean, your side is in disarray over
why
this.
Do you think that?
Well, because the papers are filled with stories about Linton Crosby, Fiona Hill attacking Nick Timothy for coming up with this policy.
Robert, you know this is Westminster tittle-tattle about various Westminster figures. The campaign, of course...
Well, you're right, because the big issue here is that this was Theresa May's policy. She made a misjudgment.
No, this is Theresa May leading our party. We've put into the policy now some additional reassurance because of the scaremongering of Labour after the manifesto was published, further reassurance that people will not lose their home, they will not lose all of their savings, but yes, some people will be will be asked to make a contribution to raising the quality of social care.
Now, I talked to Jeremy Corbyn about the credibility of his economic policy.
Yeah.
The IFS says that cutting immigration to the tens of thousands would hit tax revenues by around £6 billion a year. Where are you going to get that money from?
Well, it's not possible to make that judgment yet until we see the pace.
So you're telling, so you are a rare politician who thinks the IFS is not an impartial judge?
No, the IFS has always been an impartial judge, but it's not possible to be precise about these costings until you see the path of reduction of the immigration.
It is going to cost money, though, isn't it?
Well, there are costs and there are also benefits in reducing the pressure on public services. But the IFS did say about our manifesto that it's steady as she goes.
But are you anywhere nearer understanding the costs of reducing immigration to that target?
Well, we'll be able to be more precise about the cost when we see the timetable following the Brexit negotiations for getting immigration down. But there are benefits as well.
I'm going to have to cut you off. Thanks to Messrs Corbyn, Fallon and Nuttall, and of course to Tasmina and Vince. See you next week when there'll just be 4 days left before the election. Woohoo! Goodbye.
I've been